Right, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're located in the world. Welcome to this webinar about migration and transformation, where me and Benjamin from Sharegate will talk you through the hour and hopefully address some interesting topics.
A whole hour?
It will be a whole hour, indeed. Yeah, we'll see. Maybe it will take a bit longer. We'll see. But the idea is initially to take an hour here. So Ben, could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. So again, thanks for joining. My name is Benjamin Niaulin. I work at a company called Sharegate. So if you have any questions, of course, don't hesitate. I'm a Microsoft MVP and regional director. What does that mean, really? It means that I share on blogs, share content a lot. Also have access to the roadmap, what's coming ahead, which allows us to better talk about things like migration and how to go to Office 365, because we do have some insight on what's coming. And at Sharegate, I am a product manager, so I take care of the roadmap as a whole, what goes into the product, where we're headed in general. And I guess that's it.
Cool. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Introduction about me. I'm Erwin van Hunen. I'm just like Ben, an MVP. I'm not a regional director, but they wrote down MCM here, which means that I'm one of the dinosaurs that went through the certified master training. At Rencore, I am the product owner, which is the Rencore way of saying that you're a product manager, and for transformation tooling. So in this case, I am responsible for SP Transformator. When we start to talk just a few minutes before this webinar, Ben was asking me what that little Office 365 logo is doing on my photo there. And that is a reference to the fact that I'm a member of the P&P team.
What's P&P?
P&P, Patterns and Practices, SharePoint Patterns and Practices. So basically,
what is that?
I'll explain to you. Great.
Okay.
Good question. Good question. Great feedback. The P&P team is a group of people consisting of people from Microsoft and the community. I'm one of the community members, and we and that scares us every now and then still a bit. We own the development story of SharePoint. So
okay.
Microsoft basically told us, you guys own the whole development story. That includes documentation, the APIs, and everything. Still, Microsoft built the APIs, but we help the community out there to introduce them to the new APIs, to the new functionality, to the future, where are things happening, etc., etc., etc. So it's quite a broad responsibility. And it's a crazy effort, and it's a lot of work, it's a lot of fun, and the fact that it's effectively the community owning the whole development story is a great change from, I think, what used to be, where SharePoint was a black box, and every now and then, every so many months, there was an update coming out, and you would just have to figure out how it works. So that's what P&P is all about. But enough about P&P. Let's move over to the topic of today. But before we do that, I would like to point out that in the Zoom webinar you're in right now, there is a way to ask us questions. And we prefer if you would use the Q&A functionality in there. If you look at the toolbar, there is a button Q&A, click in there, ask a question. We prefer that way because we can actually mark questions as answered. So while we're doing this webinar, Ben and I and Christine will actually look at these questions and we have better control over them. So if you can use the chat if you want to, but if you have a question to us, use the Q&A system. That would be great. Okay, so here's a few slides from Ben. Ben, could you please introduce us?
So again, thanks for joining, everyone. I know for some it may be really late, some it may be really early. We wanted to talk about migrations from SharePoint to Office 365. And what I noticed is that this can mean very different things for two different people. And there's two slides that help me talk about this a little bit. I've presented them before, but I think it was good for us to begin with before we move on to discussions about migrations. Because today, this can be very simple, like it can be very complicated. Most of us, if we're talking about a SharePoint migration, we're talking about on-premises SharePoint to SharePoint Online that is in Office 365. And seeing so many migrations from where I work, but also via conferences, from discussions, from customer visits, I'm seeing the same thing happen. And I feel like a lot of us say, I'm migrating to Office 365, but not many of us actually migrate to Office 365. What does that mean? What I mean is that we're actually just getting hosted by Microsoft for many of us. We come from on-premises, and in fact, that's all the things I have in the back there. That's the whole migration journey, really, that I'm seeing happen today. Is we start from on-premises, and we're in control. It's easy. I've got Exchange, I've got SharePoint, I've got some file shares, maybe I got some other products, but I'm in control. It's top-down, classic. I deploy my Office, I deploy my updates, I deploy the training, I deploy the governance. I'm in control as IT. Of course, then I heard about this Office 365. And this is interesting to me as IT, or to bring my SharePoint there, because I'm thinking, oh, I get faster updates. Microsoft already has a ton of new things for SharePoint in Office 365. But on premises, I haven't even seen them yet, right? We're talking about SharePoint 2019 at this point for some of these updates. And I'll have to deploy it. There's cost related to it, whereas online, it's more affordable because I know I have, on top of that, other tools. I've got Skype for Business or Teams. I've got Planner. I've got all these other things that we are hearing about, additional value for less dollar in most cases. And what's happening is that when we're talking about going there, right, we also have growing user needs. Our end users, they're not like our end users when we were deploying SharePoint 2007 or 2010. They're very different today. When you hear the buzzword of digital workplace and modern workplace, we're talking about people that are technology savvy. They're going home with Teslas. Not everybody, but you get the idea. We're used to Uber, we're used to Airbnb. I don't even think Erwin, when he travels, looks at hotels anymore. I think he just looks at Airbnbs, for example. So there's an app, there's reviews, and we get to work, and we're just bringing our SharePoint online for most of us. So what I'm seeing through almost, the thousands of migrations that we're seeing through our app is that people are going from on-premises and they're going online. They're not going to Office 365 as a platform. Yes, they're there. It's called Office 365, but they're keeping the same architecture. They're still thinking about SharePoint as SharePoint was on premises. They're still looking for the equivalent from what they had. It's like, well, what's this now? Where's my workflows now? And it's very, very different.
They're effectively moving instead of migrating.
Exactly. They're moving to online. Do you mind going to the next slide, Erwin?
Yep.
So what I'm telling, or what I'm saying, is that there's a need to also transform or adopt. When people say adopt the digital workplace or modern workplace, what we're really saying is to look at Office 365 and what the mindset of Office 365 really is. What is it saying to people? It's saying, yes, you've moved to the online and you get the value, you get the updates, but you're still in standalone SharePoint. You're not yet connected to groups, for example. You're not yet using Teams. You're not yet doing self-service. You're often locking it down. You want to block groups. You want to, keep the control that you had before, because for many of us, the migration from SharePoint to Office 365 is really, I want to be like I was before, but I want to get the value of online. But it goes beyond that today. Today, we're talking about different challenges for organization. Things are changing, and just to stay alive, there's some changes happening. Think about your own organization. I'm sure it's happening right now in your organization. The CEO's probably talking, or the execs are probably talking, where things are changing. They're changing everything. They're trying to find a new vision, a new roadmap. How can we be different? And is what we're seeing in many places. Office 365 introduces self-service, cross-product productivity in a way. What we mean by that is we're no longer talking about SharePoint. SharePoint is part of a team of products, and together these products offer a group of people the ability to work better, for example. It's decentralized. As an IT person, we can't keep control over everything anymore. We have to find different ways of maintaining security. And we're talking about flat versus top-down, which is also very different, right? Because we used to think cycle action, subsite, 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 subsite. Cycle action, subsite, subsite, subsite. And I've seen a lot of those. And now the subsite button is not really encouraged. It's create a new group, create a new site collection. So we're very flat versus top down. And even the concept of hierarchy, which is introduced using hub sites, is a logical concept. It's not physical. It's regrouping, ungrouping, plugging it back in. And of course, there's a different layer to security. So there's tons of things that we can discuss about migrations today. And often I separate them into a couple of parts: the planning, the moving, the validating, the adoption of the new workplace or the new environment, and then the management of all of that. All of that is moving or migrating to the destination. But before we got started with Erwin, I wanted to just introduce this concept or introduce this thought to think about it. Have you moved to Office 365, or have you transformed and migrated to Office 365? It's not going to happen overnight, but
there's a thing I would like to bring up here, and that's that you mentioned the self-service thing, and I think that's actually important to address. So if you look at traditional IT environments on-prem, self-service was a no-go. And if you think about it, one of the, I would assume, main reasons for that being a no-go is resource consumption. If you give people control of what they create and how to use, they will create like crazy. They will consume disk space, memory, CPU cycles, whatever they will do to just because they're creating sites and sites and sites. That issue is not present in the cloud. You will never notice that, and it happens, but you don't even see it happening, but you move among servers when you navigate around in Office 365. Even if you find a site that you navigate to on day one, on day two, that site might actually be hosted by a different machine the next day. Mm-hmm. And you don't see that happening, but it does happen. And that's how they handle the scalability of things. And so the whole issue of resource consumption, and there are a few buts, of course. There is not like unlimited disk space, and there is also not unlimited API access, but is a much less of an issue when on-prem. And if you come from a traditional IT environment and you move to the cloud, that might scare you a bit, like, oh, are my users really mature enough to actually handle this? But you have to keep in mind also that Office 365 has to be designed from the beginning to allow you to do that. It's built in. And then another issue with self-service on-prem is the whole security model.
Yeah.
Are you sure that the model that you generated and set up and put in place on-prem is actually secure enough to prevent users from doing things that you don't want to do? You can 99% be sure in the cloud, it is like that from the beginning. It's been set up like that. People are, and you will notice that when you move to Office 365, or more specifically SharePoint Online, which is where my competence lies, is that the access is usually site collection or site-based, and you cannot install stuff on the servers, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All that functionality has been taken away, so you cannot do much harm. So that's where self-service becomes a very important part, I think, in the move to Office 365. Put the user in control.
I think it's almost, I don't want to say necessary, because depending on the culture, depending on the organization, there are things that will adapt. There are ways to have some self-service, but still have some control. If I'm at a bank with 60,000 users, they're looking at empowering certain people to have self-service within business units, and not necessarily opening it, because they still want to think about some of the security aspect of it, the retention policies. They have audits that happen every 3 months. However, we have to take something into consideration, is the world we live in today. And the self-service approach, the reason why it's really there and encouraged and on by default, is because your end users have a choice. Your end users, if they can't get the work that they need to get done happening, using the tools that they have at their disposal, they will go to these other things happening. So I have it on my board here, but I won't change my TV side. But what's happening is we move to Office 365. And yes, there is a challenge with adopting this Office 365 mindset, with self-service, with decentralization, with cross-product, with all of these things happening. But at the same time, there's other people going after these users, not just Microsoft trying to change their mindset. There's also Salesforce, Trello, Slack, and basically every single software now, which have become, you know, software, building software has become the new blue collar, if you want. It's the new, you know, industrial work in a line model of 2018. Now it's building software, working for a software company. That's where a lot of things are geared towards. So what happens is you're going to see in the future, in the coming years, more and more of these software trying to come for your users. If they can get it done with what you provide them through Office 365, for example, then what are you going to have in your organization? You're going to see Evernotes pop everywhere. You're going to see Trellos. You're going to see Slacks pop up, and so on. So the self-service approach is one piece to adopting this Office 365 platform. Of course, then you have to think about the security, how are you going to make that work? But anyways, we may be going off a little bit. We do want to talk about migration. I do see a question. I don't know if you had time to read it yet, Erwin?
Yeah, actually, there's actually just another question popping up here. But the question is an interesting point on the organic nature of a 365 in a world where hierarchy was king. Could you cover off the benefits and how we could sell this to our business? We are having real challenges with people understanding this new model.
It's difficult. I don't know for you, Erwin, but I've talked about it recently with a customer. Same thing. Some people get it. Some people see it as a challenge. And if you don't start with selling it or getting the buy-in from execs, I know everybody always says, "Oh, you got to get the buy-in." What does that mean? Well, for us, it was regrouping every decision maker across the business in one room and presenting the value of this. Why and how. You do need to have a certain level of selling that goes into it internally if you don't already have it. Some organizations, you have the CIO, CEO, or however your business is organized, they already get it. They understand why. But there is a certain selling that needs to happen and understanding this value, but also how you can control, how you can maintain the security, and how you can make sure that, through labels, through retention, security and compliance center, how that value of security is going to be maintained in the future, and why the self-service and organic approach makes sense. It's often relatively easy to sell the self-service approach. The value is there to be able to create when you need to create, to be able to get work done, to be able to remove the bottlenecks or the length of time before you have a response to something happening in the business. The thing that most people wonder about is how we're going to make sure that we're following our compliance, our ISO XXX, or whatever you are. If you're in the finance industry, how do you make sure that you have that audit every 3 months happening? These are the type of questions that need to be answered while you're selling the decentralization. I don't know if that answers a bit. It's often changes based on the organization.
There's another interesting part, I think, which is a strong selling factor for moving to Office 365 when compared to on-prem, and that is the cross-product bullet point you have there. If you look at traditional SharePoint on-prem, that is a know-it-all, do-it-all thing. One product, very monolithic, and does everything, including business intelligence. But when you're realistic and you look at how it did it, it actually didn't do it that well.
Yeah,
there were always better solutions out there for which you had to pay, and that's what they started to realize now in the engineering teams at Microsoft also. And they started to break out functionality out of SharePoint, take it away, and move it into a platform that is dedicated for the task and is actually simply much better at it.
Yeah.
If you compare, I even lost the name again, but what the BI part of SharePoint on-prem, if you compare it to Power BI,
performance point. That's night and day. That's not even comparable, really.
No, impossible to compare that. And there's many of those things. And you actually see that trend ongoing now also a bit with SharePoint on premises, where they already took things away from SharePoint 2016, and it's still out in the unknown what will happen to 2019 there. But there's things that they realize that they can't do it all, and they focus on what they're good at, and then for all the other things that you need, you just fire up Power BI or you use this or that. And instead of setting up this whole environment on-prem for business intelligence running with SharePoint, you can actually just say, okay, these 2 people need Power BI. Okay, we'll give them Power BI and just do those 2 people, and they're okay with that. Instead of me firing up and maintaining and all the
Yeah.
that are involved
And
in that.
you'll see, I mean, we won't talk about groups because that's a whole other topic to go into, and we'll start looking at, I see some questions about migration. We'll definitely talk about that in a moment. It's really looking at security becoming abstract, as well as retention and compliance abstracted from individual products. SharePoint does your content services, your pages, your lists, your libraries, and then you'll have Teams communication, Outlook email communication, and so on and so on. What's happening is that these security policies, these retention policies, if you have a group of people working on a new confidential project, it's not SharePoint that has to be protected for this confidentiality. It's the group and all content and all communications they create. So it makes sense that we take that piece out of it and really put it as Office 365 and cross-product and self-service. So if I create a new group of people that need to work on a project, this project is confidential, everything happening in there is managed in that way. But we're maybe moving a bit ahead of ourselves. There's a good question about best practices to migrate document to SharePoint library from a folder structure to flat metadata structure. And before we go to the migration piece, I have it over there. There's a very simple flow that usually I see for doing a migration. First, you have the business study. Do you need to go to Office 365? Do you want to go to Office 365? You evaluate all of this. Then you move on to the prepare of the migration. What does that mean to prepare your migration? Well, you want to do an inventory. You want to know what you have. We'll talk about that as well because that applies to customizations and also to your general environment, right? You'll want to know what is the risk of this migration? What are the limitations of going to Office 365 based on what you have, if any? You want to be able to estimate the effort, estimate the cost. You want to be able to define the strategy. Are you going to migrate as is and deal with it after to transform? Or are you going to transform as you migrate? That's the prepare part. Then we move on to the migrate part where we move things from source to destination. And you have to deal with whatever comes at you while you're moving. You have to deal with bandwidth issues. You have to deal with read-write speeds from your hard drives, from the SQL Server, from the database. You have to deal with performance of your IIS servers, your bandwidth, the Microsoft throttling sometimes as well. Are you going to use the migration API? And then afterwards, you have the validation of your migration. Did it go okay? What reports can I run to validate? What should I validate? And then you can move on to adopting the platform and managing the platform. In many cases, what I see is separating it under 3 categories of the pyramid. Many people will migrate and start from the me, then the we, then us. And what I mean by that is we often migrate the me part of work first. That's things that have a large quantity in the organization, but low complexity. So it's easy to migrate. So a lot of the time we'll see people migrate their OneDrive for Business and their mailbox. Why? Because they're me perspective. I'm just migrating people's individual stuff, moving it somewhere else. The impact can be low if I fail, but if I win, I've moved a lot of things to the cloud. Then they move to the we part of it, which is the file shares. If you're on file share, those are your folder structures, your shared folders. If you're on-prem SharePoint, we're talking about your team sites because they're high impact and high complexity. It takes more time to prepare the migration. And then finally, we move on to the us part, intranet portals, hub sites, publishing sites, stuff like that. Yeah, Erwin, I don't know if I'm babbling along here, but
no, it makes totally sense. And it's always wonderful to listen to you. It's now, one of the things so my focus on migration or transformation is a very technical focus. I'll admit I'm a techie and I'll stay there. I'm happy, very happy in that tech world. And when I talk to customers of our products, one of the things I usually explain and what people don't realize is that when you start to, especially what you said earlier already, what you said earlier already, is that it is not about moving, it's about transforming. It's like you have to turn things around. But in order to for instance, take a very technical concept, a SharePoint timer job. That doesn't exist anymore in the cloud. There's no way to run timer jobs on a SharePoint online server. So what do you do with those? You will have to like rewrite them into something else. But you could actually ask the question, do I really need something like that? It's not even the question of like, okay, I take technology A and move it to technology B, and it does the same thing. But that would assume that you have the same functionality that you have on-prem, you want to move it in the cloud, but that's not always the case. But the most important part to actually get that whole process up and running is to understand, what do I have?
Yeah.
And you'll be surprised how many people realize that they after looking at it, that they don't realize what they have.
Yeah.
And where does that come from? Well, it could be like consulting companies that build solutions and provision those solutions to their server, but never provided the source code, for instance. Or they were given the source code, but then there was an issue. The company fixed it. 5 months later, they released a new version, but they never updated your source code that you have in your version control system. So that could be very well a mismatch is what you think you have then compared to what you have. And then there is also those things that are effectively business logic, business processes that people can create themselves, like simple workflows. Maybe you give them access to SharePoint Designer or info path forms with some logic in there. Those are effectively part of your business process, but they are user created. They are not necessarily always created by admins or by developers. So you need to understand what is out there. And that's for instance, in our case, where Transformator comes in, because it allows you to do that inventory, and you brought it up already, to do the inventory of your customizations. So we don't necessarily look at content. That is not of much interest for our product and from our perspective. It is very important. It's very interesting, of course, to look at it, but we focus on the customizations, where you as Sharegate very much focuses on the sort of the non-customized part, the content.
No matter what you use, right? Some people would use PowerShell to get whatever they need to do. The idea is to make sure you're able to figure out what you have, because often you don't know, and whether or not they fit in where you want to go. Because sometimes they'll have, as Erwin mentioned, and I know Transformator will even allow you to transform it to the equivalent, but you want to know what do you have and whether or not it can go there. So I saw already some questions about limitations of custom workflows, event receivers, and things like that. These are part of that customization world where you want to know what you have. Most of the time, we don't realize we have duplicates. We have a bad architecture. We have bad logical information architecture. You want to know what you have. You want to start there. Even if you're migrating from file shares, you want to understand what you have and how it's going to go to the destination. So it's really, really important. You know what I do? I have a little trick. I have this little Excel file. It's not super complicated. And it's really because I work in the dev world a lot through working on a product company, is when I approach a migration project, I'll start with the inventory. I want to know what I have, where it is, with as much details as I can. These details, they allow me to point the effort. I want to evaluate. There's no one's going to ever tell you how much time it's going to take you to migrate. If they can, they're most likely lying. It can only be estimates, and the only way to do it is through an inventory and figuring it out. What I mean by that is the same size of data. So let's say we have 10 gigs to migrate. If it's one document library with 10 1 gigabyte files with no version history, no metadata, will take us a couple of seconds. Another 10 gigabytes of a document library with hundreds and hundreds of files with lots of metadata, with lots of version history, might take us a lot longer to migrate because we have to go through all of that. So it's really about evaluating the effort of your migration. So what I do is I export the inventory. I don't know what you do, Erwin, but I export it, and then I'll do a pointing system. I might go get the business owner, the site collection owners, the site owners, and say what's really in there. But hopefully I can do it most on my own through help of tools or whatever you use to figure out this is a 10, this is usually my maximum, this is a 5, this is a 2, and then I use it as a benchmark. Okay, I put that other site that has 4 workflows, 3 document libraries, and lots of managed metadata. I put it as a 5 to migrate. This new thing that I'm looking at in my Excel list, this new site that I have to migrate, is it harder or is it less work? And then that allows me to set milestone to prioritize my migration. How many points can I do in 1 month? How many points can I do in 3 months? And then set the project over time.
Yep, that's it. very valid approach, I would say. Transformator indeed helps you there too. When we analyze a farm, we analyze the solutions, and we're going to artifact level. So we go to like content types and lists and event receivers, etc. We look inside of them. We generate a complexity value when it's just low, medium, or high, very complex. That's basically it, and that's it. We don't put like, oh, this will take you 2 hours or 5 hours or 3 hours or 25 days or whatever. Nothing like that. And then essentially the system you're using with your Excel file, that would map totally to our approach too. Basically, you can export that data to an Excel file and then work your way through it, and that's how you do your planning. And especially what you say, size of data has no relationship to complexity of migration. Zero relationship there.
Yeah, I often get people telling me, well, Ben, I have 20 gigs of 50 gigs of 500 gigs. How long is my migration going to be? No idea. It can be 3 months or it can be 2 weeks. I have no idea. Perfect. So we've got the preparing of our migration. The next step is obviously to migrate. And migrate will be essentially in terms of structure and content, to essentially move it, maybe transform it a bit to match the destination. For customizations, it's a whole other story that Erwin will touch in a moment. But there's a question I wanted to get at for a while, which was, what is the best practice migrating documents to SharePoint library from a folder structure to a flat metadata structure? First, I do want to say this is not a mandatory thing. No one is forcing you to go from a folder structure to a flat metadata. When we talk about going from top-down to flat, we mean about the hierarchy of our architecture in SharePoint, going from a site collection with subsites, which I've seen many people have hundreds of subsites, to a model where site collections stay at the root level and we have a flat architecture around. Inside your document libraries, it's not the end of the world if you use folders. It's not the end of the world if you don't use folders. You have to choose what's best for that scenario. So I'll still use folders in some scenarios because it makes sense for applying permissions. Instead of breaking my permissions per document, for example, I may want to use some rules, some business processes, work with my folder structures and workflows. Who knows? So it's not bad to go to folder structure when you're online. In fact, some of the features that Microsoft have built depend on that behavior still because people are still using it. And I find forcing people to use metadata, it's like, I don't want to work on my document feel like filling out my mortgage form. It's long, it's painful. It has to be better. You have to make my life better and easier. And if it's entering metadata, perfect. But if it's more complex than the folder structure I had, I'm not going to follow. I'm not going to obey. If it's too complicated, I'll go get Dropbox or Box or whatever that allows me to do it. So I wanted to take that out. And then in terms of changing it, that's where, unfortunately or fortunately for me, that's where using tools happen that allows you to take a folder structure, mapping it to a flat model, and applying, say, the folder name to a metadata value that you have in your columns, or enriching it through metadata. But then there's, of course, the aspect of migrating customizations, which I'm not so comfortable with. I think Erwin can talk a lot more about that.
So customization migration is a complex story. It is actually, and I see actually a couple of questions here that sort of relate to that. One of the questions is here that migrate large lists with items and broken inheritance, and it will be a long process. And then the next question is like, it's an awesome slow process to migrate site collections, sub collections. Unfortunately, yes. And I don't think there's much there you can do about it other than try to automate as much as possible. I also want to recommend you to do it sooner than later. If it is in your roadmap to move to Office 365, do it as soon as possible, because then it's already there. If you start to grow more data on-prem, then it will just take longer in the future. It will just take longer. So try to move over as soon as possible. Now, when it comes to transformation of customizations, the complexity there is that many of the constructs and artifacts that we have on-prem are not present in the cloud. I'm talking about, for instance, event receivers. While event receivers are there in the shape of webhooks, they have their downsides too. For instance, if you build your logic in a way that an event receiver immediately disapproves something the moment you create something. Say, I don't know what the logic would be, but there is a problem with webhooks, because webhooks, and you might not be aware of that, but a webhook is asynchronous and it runs can take up to 5 minutes. For the techies out there, it's actually a timer job calling that web service. So there's a timer job on the SharePoint server in the cloud, making the call out to your webhook. So there can be a delay. So that might not necessarily be an answer for you to use. So you will have to think about what are the requirements. And what I usually recommend is that when you start to move customizations over, try to find the person that customization was built for and talk to that person, because it might very well be that customization is not relevant at all anymore. It's not important. You might even want to skip it. It doesn't make sense. No, I never used this. Actually, yeah, that was built for me 5 years ago and that was cool at the time, but totally not relevant anymore. So consider talking to the original owner of the customization or the main user of the customization and see if it's needed. Try to move your customizations into the more modern constructs. And there's a question about, for instance, workflows. And the question was in the chat, what are the limitations of custom workflow event receivers in the cloud? Should we go for flow, or are SharePoint workflows the most wanted? You have to realize that Microsoft is effectively not putting any investments in the workflow engine as we know it. So SharePoint 2020 workflows, 2010 workflows, they will be around for years to come, but nothing will change there. That's how it is. So if you want to move to a more dynamic platform where you actually see new features popping up in the future, I would strongly recommend you to look into Microsoft Flow.
And that I can tag along one of the questions. What about migrating from SharePoint workflow to Flow? What are the ways to do it? Is there a way?
Yeah, so we are actually working on that currently with our product. So what we already do is that we, when we run an inventory on your farm, we'll find all workflows. And that can be configured workflows that come from a WSP file, a farm solution, but also workflows that people have created in sites with, for instance, SharePoint Designer. And we will visualize those workflows for you in Transformator. We are working with other vendors to actually help you to transform that workflow to another product. And we're absolutely also looking at Flow, Microsoft Flow. Will it be a one-to-one migration or transformation? No. There will always be some manual work, but you will get a good starting point. Hooking into that, we're doing the same thing with InfoPath Forms. So InfoPath Forms, yeah, we all know it's been dead now for I don't know how many years. I still remember walking around on, I think Microsoft Ignite in, was it Chicago, I think, where there was an official funeral held, where people walked around with a coffin through the conference, burying InfoPath. It was a big event at the time. So it's still around. It's still supported for until
2026, I think.
Oh, 2026 even. So quite some years to go. But maybe you want to move away from it because the client is not being updated. And if you use the InfoPath Designer, there is no new version that got stuck in SharePoint 2013, Office 2013. So you want to maybe move away to something else. And there are third-party products there from various vendors that have forms technologies. And there is Microsoft Power Apps as a potential solution there for you to use too.
And just in terms of, let's say you're not looking at the product in terms of migrating your workflows to Flow, you have to bear in mind that they're different technologies and they work differently. So you may not want to necessarily always converge all your SharePoint workflows into flows because they're very different. The SharePoint workflows were built on SharePoint for SharePoint, so they belong to the library or they belong to the site. Flows are meant to be owned by individual users. They're like IFTTT or Zapier. They're meant to automate things for you, and they've been applied to SharePoint as one of the sources of data available. It's been changed and it's been worked in a way to start being better for SharePoint. That's what the SharePoint team is doing by adding them to libraries and stuff like that. But understand Microsoft Flow very well before you looking at transforming your workflows to Flow in that case. Just a little add on to that. I'll go.
Point. I mean, and also, I mean, flow is not the end to everything when it comes to your workflow questions or your workflow implementations. So that you could move out to Azure functions that get triggered by certain events in a queue and etc. There's many technological solutions out there that you could venture off into and find an answer to how you handle your automated processes of your data, processing of your data. So and that's also a bit of the complexity when moving to the cloud and moving to Office 365 and SharePoint Online. You will have so many more options, and there is no clear guidance to say if you have this, then you use that.
Yeah.
No, you will have to look at what you're doing and what maps the best to what you're doing and what you want to continue doing with your customizations.
Yeah. In terms of migrating, so some people are asking about what are the best practices for migrating either large lists or content or things like this. You have, in all honesty, looking at what I'm seeing using our data and things, you want to use either the SharePoint migration tool that Microsoft had come out. Basically, at the end of the day, you want to use something that uses the migration API that Microsoft made available.
Right.
If you're not using the migration API using PowerShell, if you're not using the migration API using the SharePoint migration tool, and if you're not using the migration API using a third-party tool, obviously I'm going to talk about Sharegate, but whatever tool you're using, you're not going to have a good time migrating to Office 365. The reason for that is there's a lot of there's slower speeds to migrate if you're not using that. And when we're talking slower speeds, we're talking slower speeds to the point where they're even going to cut off if you're going at it too hard for too long in the migration scenarios. So you definitely want to be using one of those options, evaluate them well, see the pros and cons. And whether you're migrating, I see a large list with broken inheritance, I mean, that's completely up to you. The Microsoft's beautiful world means that you manage the permissions at the group level and try not to break it down within the SharePoint piece itself. That's just not going to be reality. So of course you can use the API to migrate all of that. You can keep your manage metadata column as well. Keep the terms that were used. If you use the migration API and there's a command on a PowerShell command as well, there's a term store import that allows you to migrate your term store before. There's a hybrid model available as well where both of your environments uses the cloud managed metadata service. So in terms of managed metadata, in terms of migrating large lists, you're good regardless of what you're using. You just may want to look at the possibility that you'll lose certain references to your keywords, because if you use the reference as a GUID to point to your keyword in your column and it's not the same GUID, then you may have some issues. But Microsoft has some ways to keep those while you migrate. So you should be good on that front. And then lastly, there's that good question. Of course, my friend Matthew, as always, thanks for joining the webinar once again. We're talking about going from classic to modern with all of this. And you have to be careful with that. What I mean by that is there's going from classic to modern, and then there's going from classic to modern and connected to groups, which is completely different. Classic to modern is a SharePoint concept. It's the SharePoint product that's living through a transformation itself. It's going from classic interface to a modern interface / experience. On top of that, there's also something else happening, which is connected to Office 365 group. That's something else. So you really have three things to think about. When you're migrating, you're going to likely stay in classic mode when you migrate, depending on how you migrate. You have the choice, in fact. And you can choose to go from classic to modern directly. You can control it through PowerShell to convert all site collections, as long as you're a site collection administrator at least, or SharePoint admin, to convert them from classic to modern. You can do it site collection by site collection as well if you want to go and make sure you can evaluate this change before you make it. There's tons of ways to go from classic to modern. That should be done through the Microsoft way as much as possible. You're going to have options. There's classic to modern. The next step is going.
I can bring up
go for it. Go for it.
Little sidetrack there. It talks about when we talk about classic to modern migration. Actually, the PnP effort has a scanner, a free open source scanner available that you let loose on your tenant, and will tell you how migratable a site collection is from classic to modern it knows of the limitations, that what can you do in modern and what can you do, and will tell you in a nice report. Okay, this is missing.
Definitely check it out. That's something free, right? The PNP is all free.
All free.
We love that.
Yep.
So check that out and look at if your classic can go to modern. PNP is the reference for that. And then once you've passed the modern, you may have another choice. Do you want to be connected to groups? Now for that, I would say wait a little bit. The reason for it is Microsoft is coming out with something they call Groupify. Site collection administrators will have the option to turn their standalone SharePoint site collection into one connected to Office 365 group. What's going to happen, it's going to generate a new Office 365 group without the SharePoint piece and plug the existing SharePoint site collection there. You're going to maintain permissions, maintain the site template you were using. Nothing's going to change, just that your SharePoint site collection is going to be part of an Office 365 group there. So if you're looking for Groupify, I would say wait a little bit instead of doing it somehow yourself at the moment.
Groupify is a working title, by the way. It's not necessarily what it would be called in the end.
It works too well to say it like that.
Yeah, exactly. It does actually. Yeah. But that's a very valid point about connecting groups to your site.
Yeah. Go ahead. But I see a question about site hierarchy that for me I've seen often. I can answer quickly. Is there any guidance? There's no more web app. The guidance is simple. It's flat in that way. So what you'll see is much more an organic way of organizing. There's a good slide from Microsoft. I wish I had it right now, but it's an organic thing where you have the hub site that works as a logical grouping type of thing. Yeah. And then you'll have groups getting created, communication sites getting created, and that is your architecture. There's no more web app. It's just all site collections flat in terms of physical architecture and using the hub sites to provide a logical architecture around your organization structure.
I can give a bit of technological background what's happening here actually. I mean, the reason that web app existed, effectively think about it, was just basically, again, to manage resources. It was consuming CPU cycles, and you actually could set up for various web apps separate profiles, if you want to say it so, on how they could use the resources on the environment. And then there was a physical structure, being the site collection and subwebs, and they introduced that effectively to be able to create a hierarchy. But they also realized that the site collection was, from a resource perspective, pretty expensive. It actually used a lot of resources on the SharePoint environment, and that's where there were subwebs coming on. But that whole story is not relevant anymore in the cloud. So that's where you see, is that the focus on subwebs is sort of disappearing. They're still there, especially in classic sites, but it's sort of disappearing. And there's actually no physical reason anymore to get subwebs. So if you go for like
subwebs, I think that's the developer word for subsite.
Subsite, sorry, yeah. I speak developer, indeed, sorry. Yeah, subwebs and site collections, and in the end user world, if you want to call it, it's sites and subsites, yeah. So if there is no real technical reason for that anymore. So that's where the focus is very much on a flat structure, and then there is a logical structure by means of hub sites. And that makes you way more flexible because you can remove a site from a hub site and move to another site without actually affecting the URL structure and all kinds of other things that are like sort of traditionally in your way of moving around your structure. Because I'm not sure how it is for you, Ben, but I think many, especially the larger organizations, they don't have a goal of making money. Their goal seems to be reorganizing every year. And that's really their main goal. And when they do that, it means that the whole structure changes. This unit goes there, this unit goes there. And then if you're like baked in stone, like you have like this URL structure, it is not relevant anymore. It makes no sense. So you have to move to a logical structure. And that's where hub sites come in. They make a lot of sense, and hub sites are not out there yet. It's not been released yet. It's in preview. It will come very, very soon. The APIs are all there already. It's just not released to the full world yet, but it will come.
I used it with one of the beta customers, if you will, for Microsoft, and already love it. Customer loves it and already helps immensely. So I'm sure you'll love it as well. Looking forward for it to come out for everybody.
Okay. So the question here is, what is the best option to migrate on-prem SharePoint Farm solution to SharePoint Online? For example, convert such solution to provider hosted apps, Azure Web Apps. Again, there is no clear answer there, unfortunately. First of all, I don't know what the solution is doing, so I would look at what it is doing, what is in there, what are you trying to accomplish, and then see what is my toolbox. Think of Office 365 as a big box with Lego bricks. And how can I fit them together? They all match, they all fit on top of each other. Does it look good? No, not always. So you have to make something nice out of it. Use them and use what they're good at, and map your functionality in your on-prem farm solution to those components that are available in the cloud. And that can be an Azure function with an Azure storage queue, that can be a flow, that can be a Power App, it can be Power BI, whatever there is for you to use. So there is no best option. My starting point would be like, look at the solution. What is it doing? What is it trying to accomplish? What is still relevant in the solution? A very important question is, because there is a solution installed on the farm, it doesn't mean it's used. So figure out if the solution is being used. That's again, and now I'm doing the little product pitch here, but Transformator, when we analyze your farm, we look at usage of artifacts. For instance, we tell you, like, okay, you provisioned the content type with this solution. No one is using that content type because we didn't find any document in your environment that is using that content type. So consider if this content type actually needs to be moved over to the cloud. Those kind of things. We also check out when the last time the time a job ran and that kind of stuff. So that is important information to like filter down, make your life easier, filter down in what you actually have to focus on, and only focus on that stuff that is still relevant.
Absolutely. There's a good question around moving to Office 365 is also making use of other tools, Microsoft Teams, for example. What is your advice, experience on migrating department documents? Should these go into SharePoint sites related to MS Team? The way I've looked at it so far, and again, I was fortunate enough to be able to use hub sites at a customer with real world scenarios. And I think it really, that's not where the departments, the divisions, the large projects, I find so far have become hub sites. And these will often be communication sites that have been converted to hub sites because we're publishing information. We've got generally stored documents that are used mostly for reading. And the Microsoft Teams, they're smaller groups of collaboration. They're not a Microsoft team, though supports an immense amount of number of users, but the immense amount of users in a team actually comes from a need of Yammer, because the membership provider is an Office 365 group. And when you create a Yammer group, it creates an Office 365 group. So Microsoft was forced to increase the limit of group owners and group members because of that Yammer model of open communication. But a Microsoft team is really about a team working together, and they get a SharePoint site for their collaboration. So when I'm talking about that we and that us, right? When you're in that mindset, everything related to we work, for me, that's Microsoft Teams plus the group that comes with it, the SharePoint, the planner, it's we work. When you're talking about us work, department, divisions, then for me, we're at another level, and that's where I start talking about a hub site, a communication site, maybe a publishing, something a little bit higher that's more in the us mindset. That's how I kind of separated them, where Teams really belongs to the we, the collaboration. Even if you look at the Microsoft image for it, it's people working on building the Ferrari, right? And then the communication site is announcing that we've won to everybody. So it's really changing that mindset with communication teams. And I also want, their question about using all of our tools together, remove the notion of SharePoint by itself. You're still able to do it because we're in a transition, but you're either on-prem or you move to online, and it's going towards you always get the package of tools together. So as soon as you're working in the we mindset, the collaboration, you're not leveraging the SharePoint or the Microsoft Teams model. You're leveraging that collaboration aspect together all the time. It's just going to be groups in the future, unless you're not doing a we type of scenario, you're using an us type of scenario, and now you're talking about communication sites, hub sites, and other things. I'm battling along again too much.
No worries, no worries. There's a question here, like any guidance on migration of sites that contain a significant amount of CSAM? Well, I would say good for you that you use CSAM, because that is where you want to go to. The client-side object model has been designed explicitly to be able to run code outside of SharePoint. So I assume that that code is actually not located in the site, but is located outside of the site and running somewhere else. And now you just point that onto your SharePoint Online environment, and you can just happily run and continue to run. That's the whole idea behind CSAM. Stands for client-side object model. You're good there. Actually, the CSAM APIs in Office 365 are much richer than the on-prem versions, and they are being updated much more often on a monthly basis. That's one of the things that P&P is actually responsible for. We release the new builds of CSAM every month. And then connected to that question, there's like, would it be possible to inject JavaScript to customize modern experience in SharePoint at some time? We have a lot of document libraries on premises with JavaScript injections and are forced to remain in classic experience in Office 365 for right now. The answer there is very unlikely that you will be able to inject JavaScript. Your way forward there would be SPFX components. Then put your JavaScript in those SPFX components and provision them as SPFX components to your environment and add them. That can be application customizers, that can be field customizers, it can be a web part. But that's where you go when it comes to customization and injecting JavaScript. There is a third-party community-created script editor, SPFX component, but that's not officially sanctioned by Microsoft. It's there for you to download and install if you want to. But I would strongly recommend you to consider diving into SPFX, which is effectively just JavaScript. Okay, the main development environment is very much focused on TypeScript, which is just a derivative of not a derivative, it's actually a higher level of, I would say, easier to maintain version of JavaScript. In the end, it's just JavaScript. And I would strongly recommend you to invest in that and look into that. Now, sorry to cut it short, but we actually have 2 minutes left, and I have a few more slides, and then I think.
I think one thing that I would leave on as well is Erwin and I wrote a migration checklist, and I think we have an essentials checklist for customizations that either came out or is coming out. This is not product pitch. This is purely a migration checklist. Things to look for, things to plan, things to watch out for, things to do that have no relation to either of our product. This is really just a migration checklist. More they encourage you to download it and check it. It's the I think it's called the Ultimate Migration Checklist, and Erwin's Essentials Checklist to definitely look at. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us, of course.
Right. So I would like to, and of course this is a Rencore webinar, so I will do a little bit of a product pitch here, which is my product, Transformator, which is a tool that helps you to analyze and discover your customizations and actually helps you to also move those customizations to modern technology. So it runs an analysis of your farm, it analyzes that, or it runs an inventory of your farm, it analyzes that inventory and helps you to discover all your customizations that can be features, event receivers, web parts, timer jobs, etc., etc., etc. We analyze the code for you. We'll tell you how migratable that code is to CSAM. We transform visual web parts to SPFX web parts to a certain extent. It's not a complete transformation. It's a starting point, but we help you there. So I strongly urge you to check this out. We have a white paper. The essential checklist, what you just mentioned, you can go to rencore.com and download that white paper. You'll find stories from both me and Benjamin in there. Absolutely recommend it to check it out. I also would like to bring up the state of SharePoint and Office 365 customizations, which is an annual survey we do from Rencore, where we look at, okay, how is it out there with SharePoint? What are people doing? How are they using it? Where are they currently and where are they going? You can take that survey yourself. If you take the survey, you can go to rencore.com. If you take the survey, you make a chance to win either a ticket to the European Collaboration Summit, which is in Mainz in May, or the North American Collaboration Summit, which is in Las Vegas, also in May. Correct?
No, that is in Branson, Missouri.
Oh, that's sorry. You're right. Right. I'm mixing up the with another conference.
That is next week.
Yeah, this is next week. Yeah. Good point. Thank you. Or you can win a training bundle from Voitanos from Andrew Connell, Mastering the SharePoint Framework course Ultimate. Really good value there. And we also give away some Amazon vouchers. So make sure that you take the survey. It's a great insight. By signing up, you will get a copy of that survey. Thank you, Benjamin, for...
Thanks, Erwin. It looks like you like music or pianos.
I actually, well, I do the soundtrack of the company. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
No, I indeed, I do some music as a hobby. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Erwin, for inviting me today.
My pleasure. It was a great time having you here. And thank you for all people attending. We will send you the link to the recording. So just keep track of your inbox. There will be a link coming with the recording of this webinar. So you can listen to us again if you want to. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.